I try to schedule a sermon about Islam at least once a year for at least two reasons. First, it's important to learn about the world's second largest religion. There are approximately 1.6 billion Muslims in the world and approximately 2.1 billion Christians. And the latest statistics I've seen have Islam on track to overtake Christianity and become the world's largest religion around 2070. A second reason that I try to preach at least once a year about Islam is that there's a lot of Islamophobic misinformation out there that needs to be corrected. I'll limit myself this morning to just a few examples. For instance, contrary to popular stereotypes that all Muslims are Arabic terrorists, not only are overwhelming numbers of Muslims not terrorists or terrorist sympathizers, but also most Muslims aren't even Arab. Only 20% are. And the countries with the largest Muslim populations are Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and Nigeria. And those five, those are all democracies, disproving the myth that Islam is incompatible with democracy. Furthermore, Saudi Arabia has only the 16th largest Muslim population, behind countries such as Uzbekistan, Ethiopia, Turkey, and Iran. For what it's worth, Saudi Arabia's Muslim population is roughly equivalent to China's Muslim population. The huge numbers of Muslims outside the Middle East show both the diversity of Islam and the present, as well as the hope for an increasingly pluralistic Islam in the future. Along those lines, my sermon title for this morning is inspired by the book Misquoting Muhammad, the challenges and choices of interpreting the Prophet's legacy, by Dr. Jonathan A.C. Brown. He's an associate professor of Islamic studies and Muslim-Christian understanding at Georgetown University. Brown operates, and one of the reasons he's interesting to me is that he operates at the intersection of his personal experience of being a practicing Muslim, as well as his deep immersion in the classical Islamic interpretive tradition, coupled with his commitment to modern Western methods of scholarship. I appreciate his willingness, for example, to use a provocative title like Misquoting Muhammad. But his subtitle is equally significant: the challenge and the choices of interpreting the Prophet's legacy. Because whether we are talking about Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha, Darwin, or Freud, there are challenges and choices that must be made to interpret the legacies of such world historical figures. To make my position clear from the outset, given what we know in the early 21st century, it is insufficient to blame one's prejudice, one's sexism, heterosexism, classism, racism, to blame that on historical figures or on historical documents. We must each take responsibility for the impact of the interpretive choices that we make, and we must demand that others take responsibility for the impact of the interpretive choices that they make. Because it used to be easier to make an argument that, I'm just holding this opinion because, the sacred scripture told me to. It's what we call, picking out a clobber text and then beating people over the head with it. But over the years, close readings have both traced the complicated histories of transmitting sacred teachings, which periodically has changed the originals, but it's also exposed the limited historical context in which these teachings were originally given, making it questionable to just apply them simply to all times and places, even if we did have an unadulterated copy of the original, which we don't. There's a lot to say about the history of each of the world's religions, but I'll limit myself for now to setting the stage with a look at misquoting Muhammad by briefly comparing the ways we have also seen people misquoting Moses and misquoting Jesus. One of the traditional ways that the importance of the Torah was defended is that it was seen that these first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, right? You're all with me. These first 5 books of the Bible were considered authoritative because it was thought that Moses, this great leader of the Israelite people, was understood to have personally written them. But one of the first loose strings, I think it's sometimes important to see the relationship between that English word text and the English word textile, that like a fabric, that texts are in many ways similar to fabrics, that these first loose strings that people began to tug on that led to the unraveling of Mosaic, the idea of Mosaic authorship of the Torah, was noticing that near the end of the Torah in Deuteronomy 34, that it describes Moses' death and burial. And people begin to think, now how does that work? How do you write the article about your own funeral? Centuries of further discovery, as people began tugging on that string, discovered increasing numbers of loose threads, making it clear eventually that the Torah had been woven together from at least 4 separate documents, which in turn were collected from various oral histories, all of which did not come into their final form until many centuries after Moses, likely during the Babylonian exile. If you're curious to learn more, 2 accessible introductions are Who Wrote the Bible and the Bible with Sources Revealed, both by Richard Elliott Friedman. The Bible with Sources Revealed shows those 4 different sources in different colors and sorts of types, so you can kind of see how it was stitched together. Turning to Misquoting Jesus, I highly recommend Bart Ehrman's book by that name, which also inspired the title of Brown's book on Islam. Like Moses and Muhammad, Jesus did not write down his own teachings. Instead, the Gospel of Mark, the earliest collections of Jesus' teachings, of which we have a copy, was not written until decades after Jesus' death. Moreover, if you look closely at almost any version of the Bible, you'll see, and I'm not talking about like the annotations, I'm saying like super tiny, right under the text, you'll see these super tiny footnotes that say things like, other manuscripts say. We don't have the originals for any of the major sacred scriptures, and in the case of the Christian scriptures, when you add up all those instances of other manuscripts say, there are between 300,000 and 400,000 textual variants among the manuscripts. There are around 140,000 words in the New Testament, though of course there are equal numbers of variants for every passage or word. In all fairness as well, I should hasten to add that the vast majority of those 300,000 to 400,000 discrepancies are minor. Many of them are just misspellings. Less than 1% are potentially meaningful for our understanding and interpretation of the text, and what Ehrman does in Misquoting Jesus is kind of walk you through some of the more significant of those discrepancies. The situation of manuscript transmission is different in Islam because about 20 years after Muhammad's death, one formalized official copy of the Quran was made from the various recitations and prayers and scattered parchments of Muhammad's followers. So, in Christianity, we have 4 official gospels and many other gospels. There's many according tos. In Islam, one version was made very early. And if you've never read the Quran before, there are ways in which it is much more accessible than the Bible, at least in terms of it being much shorter. It's about 4/5 the length of the New Testament, and the New Testament is about this long, and the Hebrew Scriptures is about this long. So the Quran is 4/5 the length of just the New Testament. But there are also ways in which the Quran can be much more difficult, especially for newcomers. In particular, the text is non-linear. It's 114 chapters, or surahs, are arranged not in chronological or narrative or thematic order, but approximately in length of longest first all the way down to the shortest. If you're interested in studying the text for yourself, HarperCollins is publishing a new academic study Quran next month to supplement its long-time best-selling study Bible. So there'll be lots of introductory essays accompanying explanatory annotations. But as significant as the Quran is to the Islamic tradition, also of great importance are the Hadith, which are collections of the Prophet Muhammad's sayings and actions. Hadith is from the Arabic word for report, account, or narrative. For example, the Muslim practice of praying 5 times daily, details of how to fast during the month of Ramadan are not in the Quran, but primarily in the Hadith. And unlike the Quran, for which one definitive version was made about 20 years after Muhammad's death, with the Hadith, reports of the Prophet's words and deeds were forged by the thousands. greatly increasing the likelihood there of misquoting Muhammad. And although there's much more to say about the complex tradition that has developed around interpreting some of the internal contradictions within the Quran, in which later revelations to Muhammad are usually understood to trump, or usually the word they use is abrogate, earlier sayings that may be in conflict, as well as a lot more to be said about the complex interpretive traditions that have developed around the Hadith, which ones are legitimate, which ones the spectrum of how seriously they must be followed. I want to be sure I take time to address for today the even more important pressing issue of how to interpret the Quran in the 21st century. And one of the fascinating dynamics of the intersection of the Islam as well as of Christianity with the modern world is the significant increase of individuals reading and interpreting scripture in isolation. That just wasn't the case in the ancient world to anything like the extent. So outside of any sort of community of interpreters, and often without any training in the long-standing history of interpretive traditions that are developed over the centuries. At its most damaging, the result is someone like Osama bin Laden proof texting using isolated, out-of-context verses and oversimplified interpretations to justify horrific acts of violence, not in his name, which is really what it should be in, but in the name of Islam generally. But it's important to keep in mind that the Christian tradition also, for example, has been used to inspire tremendous acts of forgiveness, mercy, and compassion, as well as tremendous acts of terror, such as the Inquisitions, such as the Crusades, which only strengthens my conviction that the responsibility here in the 21st century for the results of one's interpretation is on the individual and or the community of interpretation, much more so than the text in question. So when I hear the common diagnosis that Islam just needs a Muslim Martin Luther, I think that the situation is actually much more complicated. One of Luther's major teachings, and there's a lot to say about Martin Luther that I cannot get into right now, one of his major teachings was sola scriptura, salvation through scripture alone. But in retrospect, we can see the ways that in questioning the authority of the Roman Catholic Pope through the Protestant Reformation, Luther ended up making out of the Bible what could be called a paper pope. The Bible still has to be interpreted even if you take the hierarchy of religious leaders out of the equation. And the much more important change needed is a shift toward pragmatism, toward asking about the fruit, the results of your engagement with sacred scripture. And if your interpretation increases hate, fear, inequality, and violence, instead of increasing love and joy and justice and peace, you're doing it wrong. The community you are a part of is doing it wrong. And the problem is much more with you than the book you are reading. It's the same argument I make in support of reading banned books. The problem isn't with the text as much as whether we're teaching the practice of reading responsibly, what has been called the need to practice safe texts. And behind the question of interpretation is the question of authority. And the more progressive or theologically liberal you are, the less troubled you are by passages of scripture that are offensive to, for example, modern understandings of gender, of sexuality, of class. The more willing you are to simply dismiss those passages as obsolete. As many of you have heard me say before, the liberal turn in theology is the move from authority vested in religious hierarchy and in ancient myths about infallible revelations from above, and the move toward authority vested in reason, what is logical, and in experience, what you know to be true in your firsthand experience or because it's been proved through the scientific method. From the perspective of Unitarian Universalism, Islam is part of our third source, wisdom from the world's religions, which inspires us in our ethical and spiritual life. But our tendency is to let go of the passages that no longer seem relevant to our globalized, pluralistic, postmodern age. Our opening hymn this morning, "Where is Our Holy Church?" is a strong example of a theologically liberal reinterpretation of religion. Our holy church is not merely buildings such as this one, but wherever people gather in the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Our holy writ is not merely some ancient document, but each person's direct experience of transcending mystery and wonder. Our Holy One is not a being out there somewhere, but movements of people led by the transforming spirit of love to confront powers and structures of evil with justice and compassion. Our Holy Land is not a piece of geography, but the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. And our paradise is not first and foremost a hope in a next world, but working for justice and equity and compassion in this world, here and now. In that spirit, I will conclude with the following words from the progressive theologian Brian McLaren. He writes that there are two kinds of Christianity, along with two kinds of Islam and Judaism and every other religion and non-religion too. I saw along these lines an article in the News Post yesterday that religion will be taught in Frederick County Public Schools, and then along with that will be taught the difference between mainstream Islam and fundamentalist radical Islam. There is a huge difference. McLaren writes, the difference is that there is one of social control for each religion and one of social transformation. One to hold people down and one to lift them up. One an opiate to pacify people into compliance, the other a stimulant to empower people to imagine a better world, a better life, a better future, giving them the courage to live in peaceful defiance of violent, corrupt, and greedy powers that be. Neither kind of religion is perfect, and both kinds contain good and sincere people. But if those who use God and religion for social control are left to define faith and religion, the religion they define will be by definition a false one, an ugly one, and an idolatrous one. May we lend our hearts, our hands, our minds, and our wills to create movements of social transformation, to lift people up, to empower them to imagine and build a better world, and to join with them in solidarity to challenge injustice. And as we each continue to reflect on where each one of us might be able to be part of advancing such a movement, I invite you to rise and embody your spirit as we sing together a similarly themed hymn, number 287, Faith of the Larger Liberty.